Enlightenment in the 20th and 21st Centuries, by David Rousseau. What if enlightenment was never lost, only misunderstood? What if it is not a distant achievement, reserved for mystics in caves or sages in ancient texts, but a living possibility unfolding inside ordinary people navigating modern life? In the noise of the 20th and 21st centuries' wars, revolutions, digital acceleration, and psychological fragmentation, a quieter current has been forming beneath the surface. Not a new religion, not a doctrine, but a remembering. This is not a story of escaping the modern world. It is the story of awakening within it. Introduction: the return of inner light. There are moments in human history when the outer world becomes so loud that the inner world begins to speak more clearly. The 20th century was one of those moments. It arrived with astonishing force to world wars that reshaped the global psyche, rapid industrial expansion that transformed daily life, and technological advances that collapsed distance while expanding complexity. By the time the 21st century emerged, humanity was more connected than ever before, yet also more distracted, fragmented, and uncertain about the nature of its own mind. In this atmosphere, something subtle began to happen. People did not stop seeking meaning. They simply stopped trusting that meaning would be handed down fully formed by institutions alone. Instead, the search turned inward, not always by choice, but often by necessity. When external frameworks fracture, attention naturally turns toward the one place that cannot be outsourced: direct experience. This shift did not announce itself with ceremony. There was no singular event, no unified awakening declared across the world. Instead, it unfolded quietly, in parallel streams. A psychologist in Vienna began mapping the unconscious. A monk in Burma refined a simple technique of watching the breath. A physicist in Copenhagen wrestled with the limits of observation itself. A young person in a crowded city stared at a screen and wondered why connection felt increasingly like distance. A patient in a therapy room learned, perhaps for the first time, to feel what they had spent a lifetime avoiding. Different languages, different settings, yet an underlying question slowly unified them all. What is it that is aware of all of this? This audiobook is not a history of enlightenment as it was once imagined, remote, rare, reserved for exceptional figures in distant landscapes. It is an exploration of how the idea of enlightenment has been reshaped by modern life itself, not diminished by it, but revealed through it in new and unexpected forms. For much of human history, enlightenment was often associated with withdrawal, leaving society, renouncing desire, transcending the world of form. But the 20th and 21st centuries complicate that narrative. They place the seeker directly inside the conditions they once might have fled. Noise is no longer optional. Information is constant. Identity is continuously constructed and reconstructed through culture, media, and memory. And yet, awareness remains, unchanging, present, unclaimed by any single thought or emotion. In this recognition, a different understanding begins to emerge. Enlightenment is no longer framed as an achievement that belongs to a distant future self. It begins to resemble something more immediate: an act of noticing, a shift in identification, a moment where experience is seen without being fully absorbed by it. Modern science has approached this territory from one angle, examining attention, perception, and the structure of consciousness itself. Ancient contemplative traditions have approached it from another, refining practices of observation, inquiry, and presence over thousands of years. In the modern era, these streams do not merge into a single doctrine. Instead, they overlap like transparent layers, each offering partial clarity to a phenomenon too intimate to be fully captured by language alone. What becomes clear, across disciplines and traditions, is that awareness is not a distant destination. It is the ground in which all experience already appears. This realization does not remove complexity from life. It does not erase suffering, nor does it promise permanent serenity. Rather, it changes the relationship to experience itself. Thoughts still arise, emotions still move, the world continues in its unpredictability, but something fundamental shifts in how these events are held in consciousness. There is more space, less identification, a subtle recognition that what you are is not entirely contained within the story of who you think you are. This audiobook is an invitation to explore that recognition as it appears in the modern world not as escape, but as engagement, not as transcendence away from life, but as intimacy with it. Because enlightenment, in the context of the 20th and 21st centuries, is no longer a distant peak to be climbed. It is the quiet discovery that what you are looking for is already aware of the looking. Chapter 1. The Collapse of Old Maps. There are moments in history when the structures that once gave life coherence begin to lose their authority, not all at once, but in gradual erosion. In the 20th century, this erosion became impossible to ignore. For centuries, many people lived within relatively stable maps of meaning. Religion, philosophy, tradition, and culture provided answers to the fundamental questions of existence: who we are, why we suffer, what happens after death, and how one should live. These frameworks were not merely intellectual, they were embedded in daily life, shaping rituals, family structures, moral expectations, and even the perception of reality itself. But the 20th century introduced forces that disrupted these inherited maps at scale. Till world wars shattered the assumption that human progress naturally leads to moral improvement. Industrialized violence revealed that intelligence and technology could amplify destruction as easily as they could create comfort. The rise and fall of ideologies, some promising liberation, others order, showed how easily collective belief could become distorted into systems of control. At the same time, scientific advancement expanded outward at an accelerating pace. Physics revealed a universe far stranger than classical intuition suggested. Psychology opened a hidden interior world shaped by unconscious forces. Biology and neuroscience began to show that identity itself might be more fluid and constructed than previously imagined. The result was not simply new knowledge, it was uncertainty about the reliability of all previous certainties. In earlier eras, spiritual questions were often answered within a shared cosmology. By contrast, the modern individual increasingly found themselves suspended between multiple interpretations of reality: scientific, religious, philosophical, psychological, without a single framework capable of integrating them fully. This condition did not immediately lead to enlightenment. At first, it led to disorientation. When external maps lose clarity, the mind often responds in predictable ways. Some double down on inherited belief systems, seeking stability in tradition. Others reject all frameworks entirely, embracing skepticism or material reductionism. Still others become overwhelmed by relativism, unsure whether any meaning can be trusted at all. But beneath these responses, something quieter begins to develop. When no external map feels entirely sufficient, attention is forced inward, not as philosophy, but as necessity. If the world cannot be fully understood through inherited systems, then perhaps understanding must begin with the one constant that remains in every experience: awareness itself. This is where the spiritual inquiry of the modern era subtly diverges from earlier forms. Instead of primarily asking, what is the ultimate structure of the universe, it begins to ask, what is it that knows experience at all? This shift may seem small, but it is profound. It redirects inquiry from objects of awareness to awareness itself. In the aftermath of collapsed certainty, a new kind of exploration becomes possible, not based on belief, but on direct observation, not dependent on external authority, but on immediate experience. This does not eliminate the value of tradition or science, but it places them within a larger question: who or what is the witness of all models, all interpretations, all maps? The 20th century did not destroy meaning, it destabilized its location. Meaning could no longer be assumed to reside solely in inherited structures. Instead, it began to appear as something that emerges in the relationship between consciousness and experience itself. This is why the collapse of old maps is not only a historical event, but a psychological and spiritual threshold. It is the moment when the search for truth can no longer remain purely external. The seeker is turned back toward the mechanism of seeking itself, and in that turning, something unexpected becomes visible. Even when all conceptual maps are questioned, something remains unchanged: the fact that experience is being known. Thoughts arise, beliefs shift, identities reorganize, but awareness continues to register it all without interruption. This continuity, often overlooked, becomes the quiet foundation for a different kind of inquiry, one that does not rely on constructing new maps immediately, but on understanding the space in which all maps appear. The collapse of old maps, then, is not merely loss, it is exposure. It reveals that what was previously taken for granted as fixed identity, meaning, certainty, was always more fluid than it seemed, and in that fluidity, the possibility of a deeper form of understanding begins to emerge. Not the replacement of one map with another, but the recognition of the ground in which all maps arise and dissolve. This is where the modern spiritual journey begins, not in certainty restored, but in certainty questioned so deeply that awareness itself becomes the only remaining reference point. Chapter 2. Psychology opens the inner door. At the beginning of the 20th century, something quietly radical happened. The human mind became a subject of systematic investigation. For the first time in history, inner experience was not only the domain of philosophers, priests, or mystics. It became a field of study in its own right, measured, analyzed, and debated in laboratories and clinics. This shift did not replace spirituality, but it changed its language. Where earlier traditions spoke of the soul, modern psychology began speaking of the psyche. Where spiritual teachers described ignorance or attachment, psychology described repression, conditioning, and unconscious drives. Yet beneath the differences in terminology, both were circling the same mystery: why human beings suffer, and what lies beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. Early pioneers, such as Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, did not set out to define enlightenment, but their work opened unexpected doors into the architecture of consciousness. Freud revealed that much of human behavior is shaped by unconscious forces, memories, desires, and fears operating outside of awareness. Jung went further, suggesting that the unconscious is not only personal, but also collective, filled with symbolic patterns that appear across cultures and history. For many, this was a scientific revolution. For others, it was a spiritual one disguised in clinical language. The idea that the mind contains hidden layers immediately destabilized the assumption that I am simply what I think I am. If thoughts could arise from unconscious depths, then the sense of self built from those thoughts was no longer fully reliable. Identity became less like a fixed entity and more like a dynamic process, something constructed moment by moment from material that is not fully visible to itself. This realization marked an important turning point in the modern understanding of inner life. It suggested that awakening might not only involve transcending thought, but also understanding how thought is formed. As psychology developed through the mid-20th century, it expanded beyond pathology into human potential. The humanistic, psychologist figures such as Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers shifted attention toward growth, authenticity, and self-actualization. They asked not only what causes suffering, but what allows a human being to live more fully. Maslow's later work even hinted at a peak experience, moments of unity, clarity, and transcendence that resembled descriptions found in contemplative traditions. These experiences were not treated as supernatural, but as natural possibilities within the human psyche. In this way, psychology began to brush against territory long explored by spiritual systems, though often without acknowledging the overlap explicitly. Where meditation traditions spoke of observing the mind, psychology developed methods for understanding its patterns. Where spiritual paths aimed at liberation from identification, therapy aimed at relief from suffering caused by identification. Yet both, in their own way, were moving toward a similar insight, that much of what we take to be me is not as solid as it appears. The modern therapeutic setting became, in a subtle sense, a new kind of inner sanctuary. In the space of dialogue between therapist and client, individuals began encountering aspects of themselves previously unseen or unacknowledged. Emotions long suppressed surfaced into awareness. Narratives once taken as absolute truth were questioned and restructured. Painful memories, once avoided, were held with attention rather than resistance. In this process, something important often occurred, a small but significant shift in identification. A person might begin to notice that thoughts are not commands, but events, that emotions arise and pass, that even deeply held beliefs can be observed rather than blindly inhabited. In moments of clarity, the sense of being entirely fused with mental content begins to loosen. This loosening is not enlightenment in its final form, but it points toward its mechanism. It reveals that suffering is often intensified not only by experience itself, but by unconscious identification with experience. When every thought is believed without question, and every emotion is taken as absolute truth, awareness becomes narrowed and reactive. Psychology, in this sense, opens a door that was previously hidden, the possibility of witnessing the mind rather than being entirely consumed by it. However, it is important to see the limitation as well. Psychology can describe patterns, trace origins, and facilitate healing, but it does not always ask the deepest metaphysical question: what is it that is aware of the mind in the first place? This is where the path of inquiry begins to shift again from understanding, content to recognizing the context in which content appears. Still, psychology's contribution to modern spirituality is profound. It made inner life legitimate. It removed some of the stigma from suffering. It showed that transformation is possible not only through belief, but through awareness of pattern. Most importantly, it began to normalize the idea that the mind is not a fixed identity, but a dynamic field of processes that can be observed, understood, and gradually disentangled. In doing so, psychology did something unexpected. It did not close the door to spiritual awakening, it widened it. Because once a person sees that the mind is observable, the next question naturally arises: if the mind can be observed, what is it that is doing the observing? Chapter 3. Eastern Wisdom Meets Western Mind. When Eastern, contemplative traditions began entering Western awareness in the 20th century, it was not simply a cultural exchange, it was an encounter between two fundamentally different ways of approaching reality. The modern West had developed a powerful orientation toward analysis, measurement, and conceptual clarity. Reality was something to be broken down, examined, and understood through increasingly precise models. Progress meant accumulation of knowledge, refinement of systems, and mastery over external conditions. Many Eastern traditions, by contrast, had spent centuries refining an entirely different direction of inquiry, not only understanding reality, but directly examining the nature of experience itself. Rather than primarily asking how the world works, they often asked how the sense of world is constructed in awareness in the first place. When these approaches met, something unexpected happened. Neither fully absorbed the other, yet both were changed. Teachings from Zen Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, Taoism, and Tibetan Buddhist lineages began appearing in translations, lectures, and eventually in lived practice among Western seekers. At first, they were often interpreted through familiar Western frameworks: philosophy, psychology, or religion. But over time, something in them resisted complete conceptual capture. Zen, for example, repeatedly pointed beyond intellectual understanding. Its emphasis on direct experience, paradoxical teaching methods, and the use of silence challenged the assumption that truth must always be expressed in structured ideas. In Zen, enlightenment was not framed as something to be accumulated intellectually, but as a direct seeing into the nature of mind before conceptual division arises. Advaita Vedanta offered a similarly radical suggestion that the sense of individual separation is not ultimately real, but a misidentification within consciousness itself. What appears as me and world is, in this view, not two fundamentally separate things, but one indivisible field of awareness appearing in different forms. For Western minds trained in dualistic thinking, such ideas were often initially interpreted as abstract philosophy, but something deeper began to occur when these teachings were combined with practice. Meditation became the bridge. When attention is trained to rest on breath, sensation, or simple awareness itself, the usual habits of thought begin to reveal themselves. The mind does not remain still. It moves constantly, commenting, interpreting, remembering, projecting. But with sustained observation, a subtle distinction emerges. There is thinking, and there is knowing of thinking. This distinction is not conceptual at first. It is experiential. In that moment of recognition, the seeker begins to notice that thoughts arise on their own. Sensations appear without invitation. Emotions move through awareness without requiring permission. Even the sense of I am the one thinking is itself another thought appearing in the same field? Eastern traditions had long pointed to this realization in different forms. In Buddhism, it is often described as insight into impermanence and non-self. In Advaita Vedanta, it is recognition of the self as pure awareness, prior to identification with body and mind. In Taoism, it is alignment with the natural unfolding of reality without forced control. Yet in the modern context, these insights began to take on new expressions. They were no longer confined to monastic settings or renunciate lifestyles. They entered households, workplaces, therapy rooms, and eventually digital spaces. This created both clarity and confusion. On one hand, access to these teachings expanded dramatically. People who would never have encountered traditional spiritual lineages could now explore meditation, inquiry, and contemplative practice. On the other hand, the removal from cultural and ethical contexts sometimes led to fragmentation, spiritual ideas being extracted from the disciplines that originally supported them. Still, something essential persisted: the recognition that awareness itself is available here and now, without needing to be manufactured or attained. This recognition does not depend on belief. It depends on attention. As Western practitioners engaged more deeply with these teachings, a subtle convergence began to appear. Psychological insight and contemplative practice started informing one another. Therapy explored mindfulness. Meditation incorporated psychological understanding of trauma and conditioning. The boundary between healing and awakening became increasingly porous. What emerged was not a single unified system, but a shared exploration of consciousness from different angles. Science examined neural correlates of attention. Psychology studied patterns of identification and emotion. Contemplative traditions investigated direct experience through disciplined introspection. Each approach illuminated a different aspect of the same mystery, and yet, none of them fully exhausted it, because beneath all models, all methods, all interpretations, something remained consistent: the simple fact of being aware. This is where Eastern wisdom, when meeting the Western mind at its deepest level, does something quietly transformative. It does not ask the mind to believe something new. It asks it to notice what is already present before belief arises. In that noticing, a subtle shift occurs. Experience is no longer only something happening to a separate self. It is seen as an unfolding within awareness itself. The implications of this are not immediately dramatic. Life continues, thoughts continue, the world remains as it is. But the center of gravity begins to shift from identification with content to recognition of the field in which content appears. This is the point at which Eastern wisdom stops being merely philosophy and begins to function as lived inquiry. And in the modern world, that inquiry continues not in monasteries alone, but in ordinary moments of attention. Wherever someone pauses long enough to ask a very simple question: what is aware of this right now? Chapter 4: The Counterculture Awakening. By the mid-20th century, something unusual began to surface within Western society. Beneath the surface of economic growth, technological expansion, and political tension, a generational shift in consciousness was taking shape. It did not arrive as a unified philosophy or organized movement at first. It emerged as a mood, a questioning, and eventually a widespread refusal to accept inherited definitions of meaning without direct experience. This was the counterculture, not merely a rebellion against social norms, but a search for something those norms seemed unable to provide. For many, the post-war world offered stability but not depth. It offered consumption, structure, and productivity, but often left little room for inner exploration. As institutions grew more complex and life became increasingly mediated by systems education, corporations, media, many people began to feel a quiet disconnection from something more immediate and alive. In this space of disconnection, questions that had long been contained within religious or philosophical contexts began to reappear in everyday life. What is real? Who am I beyond roles and expectations? Is there something more direct than the narratives I have inherited? The answers were not always clear, but the questioning itself became catalytic. Music, literature, and art became primary vehicles for this exploration. Poets and writers attempted to describe altered states of perception, breakdowns of identity, and moments of expanded awareness that did not fit neatly into conventional categories. Musicians began experimenting not only with sound, but with the experience of sound itself, using rhythm and repetition to evoke states of absorption and transcendence. At the same time, some individuals turned toward Eastern spiritual traditions, which were becoming increasingly accessible in translation and through traveling teachers. Meditation, yoga, and contemplative inquiry began to circulate outside their original cultural contexts. For many young seekers, these practices offered something that felt missing, a direct way of engaging with consciousness rather than merely interpreting it. Yet the counterculture was not a single coherent movement. It was fragmented, experimental, and often contradictory. Alongside sincere spiritual seeking, there were also periods of excess, confusion, and escapism. The exploration of consciousness sometimes blurred into attempts to escape it entirely. This tension between awakening and avoidance became one of its defining characteristics. Still, within the chaos, important insights began to surface. One of the most significant was the recognition that ordinary perception is not fixed. Under different conditions, whether through meditation, intense emotion, artistic immersion, or altered states of consciousness, the boundaries of self and world can appear fluid. The sense of being a separate, stable observer can loosen, revealing a more dynamic and interconnected field of experience. This realization did not belong exclusively to any one method or ideology. It emerged wherever attention was deeply altered or intensified. For some, it came through long periods of meditation. For others, through art, nature, or profound psychological crisis. The common thread was not the external form, but the shift in how experience was being known. In this way, the counterculture unintentionally functioned as a wide-scale experiment in consciousness. It tested the limits of identity, perception, and meaning outside traditional structures. While it did not produce a unified doctrine of enlightenment, it did normalize the idea that states of awareness can vary, and that what is taken to be normal consciousness is only one configuration among many. Over time, some of the more enduring elements of this period began to separate from its chaotic context. Meditation practices became more structured and accessible. Teachers who emphasized clarity over ideology began to emerge. The language of awakening started to shift from cultural rebellion toward inner investigation. What remained from the counterculture was not a single answer, but a widening of possibility. It demonstrated, on a cultural scale, that human beings are not limited to one fixed mode of perception or identity. Attention itself can be trained, expanded, destabilized, and refined. And beneath all of these variations, something quietly persistent could still be noticed. Awareness itself remains present through every shift. This realization gradually moved the inquiry inward again. If perception can change so dramatically, what is it that remains constant across all states? The counterculture did not fully answer this question, but it helped make it impossible to ignore. In its searching, experimenting, and sometimes disorienting freedom, it opened space for a deeper inquiry that would continue into the following decades, not as rebellion, but as investigation into the nature of experience itself. Chapter 5: The Neuroscience of Awareness. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the study of consciousness entered a new phase. What had once belonged primarily to philosophy, spirituality, and introspective traditions began to intersect with one of the most technologically advanced fields in science, neuroscience. For the first time in history, the living brain could be observed in action as people thought, felt, remembered, meditated, and became aware. Functional MRI scanners, EEG recordings, and advanced computational models offered a window into the biological correlates of experience. The ancient question, what is consciousness, was now being approached through circuits, networks, and measurable activity. At first glance, this might seem like a purely material shift, mind reduced to brain, experience reduced to neurons. But as research deepened, something more nuanced began to emerge. Neuroscience did not eliminate the mystery of awareness, it made it more precise. Scientists studying attention discovered that it is not a passive background function, but an active, trainable process. The brain continuously filters vast amounts of sensory data, selecting what enters conscious experience and what remains unnoticed. In this sense, attention became understood not as something we simply have, but as something that shapes the world we live in moment by moment. This insight alone carried profound implications. If attention determines experience, then reality as it is lived is not fixed, but partially constructed through patterns of focus. In parallel, studies of meditation practitioners began to reveal consistent changes in brain activity associated with sustained contemplative practice. Long-term meditators often showed altered activity in regions associated with self-referential thinking, emotional reactivity, and attentional control. The default mode network, a system linked to mind wandering and narrative self-processing, appeared less dominant during certain states of deep meditation. These findings did not prove enlightenment in a spiritual sense, but they did confirm something practitioners had reported for centuries, that the sense of a solid, continuous me can loosen, quiet, or temporarily dissolve under specific conditions of attention. What science began to map, contemplative traditions had long explored directly, yet an important distinction remained. Neuroscience could observe correlations patterns of brain activity associated with particular experiences, but it could not directly access the first-person quality of awareness itself. It could describe the instrument, but not fully capture the music as it is heard. This gap between objective measurement and subjective experience became one of the central philosophical tensions of modern consciousness studies. Still, the dialogue between science and contemplative practice proved fruitful. Researchers began collaborating with meditation teachers and long-term practitioners, refining study designs and developing more precise language for describing inner states. Terms like non-dual awareness, open monitoring, and focused attention began to appear in scientific literature, albeit carefully defined and stripped of metaphysical claims. In clinical contexts, these insights found practical application. Mindfulness-based interventions were introduced in hospitals and therapeutic settings as tools for managing stress, anxiety, chronic pain, and depression. Patients were taught to observe thoughts and sensations without immediate identification or reaction. While the methods were simple, the effects could be significant: increased emotional regulation, reduced rumination, and a greater capacity to remain present under difficult conditions. However, beneath the clinical utility, a deeper question continued to surface. If attention can be trained, and if identification with thought patterns can loosen, then what exactly is the self that appears to be doing all of this? Is it a fixed entity located in the brain? Or is it something more fluid and ongoing process of awareness interpreting itself? Neuroscience, at its most careful, does not rush to answer this. It describes mechanisms, correlations, and functional relationships, but it leaves open the experiential question that cannot be fully resolved through external observation alone. What is it like to be the awareness in which all of this appears? This is where the limits of purely objective inquiry become visible not as failure, but as boundary. At the same time, something subtle happens when science studies meditation deeply enough. The focus shifts from trying to locate consciousness as an object in the brain toward understanding how experience is organized within awareness. The emphasis gradually moves from where is consciousness produced to how does consciousness structure experience. This shift, though subtle, mirrors a parallel movement found in contemplative traditions, away from treating awareness as something to be explained externally, and toward recognizing it as the immediate field in which all explanation arises. In this convergence, neuroscience does not replace spiritual inquiry, it refines the questions it can ask, and yet, one aspect remains unchanged across all measurements, scans, and models: the presence of experience itself. No matter how detailed the mapping of neural activity becomes, there is always the fact that something is being known from within. This simple fact resists full reduction. It is not an argument against science, but a reminder of scope. Science excels at describing patterns, processes, and systems, but awareness, the very condition under which any description becomes possible, remains the background in which all data appears. In this sense, neuroscience contributes something essential to the modern understanding of enlightenment. It grounds contemplative insight in observable physiology, while simultaneously revealing the depth of what remains unmeasured. The brain becomes not the origin of consciousness in a final sense, but part of the dynamic expression of it. And so the inquiry continues, now informed by both ancient introspection and modern measurement, moving gradually toward a shared recognition that awareness is not only something we study, but something through which all studying happens. Chapter 6: The Digital Mirror. The 21st century introduced a new environment for human consciousness, one that had no historical precedent in its scale, speed, or intimacy. Unlike previous technological shifts, the digital revolution did not simply change what humans could do. It began to reshape how attention itself is distributed, fragmented, and sustained. For the first time, vast amounts of information became instantly available, continuously updated, and socially embedded. News, entertainment, personal communication, and professional life converged into a single, always present stream. The boundary between inner life and external input grew thinner, not because awareness disappeared, but because it was constantly being redirected outward. In this environment, something subtle but profound began to happen. People started to encounter their own minds more directly than ever before, not in silence, and not in isolation, but in reflection. The digital world functions, in a very real sense, as a mirror. It reflects desires, fears, identities, comparisons, and aspirations back to the individual in real time. Social media, in particular, amplifies this reflective quality. It does not merely show the world, it shows the self as it appears within the world, constantly curated, adjusted, and observed. At first, this seems like connection, and in many ways, it is. But it is also a continuous feedback loop of attention. What is seen shapes what is valued, and what is valued reshapes what is seen. Over time, this loop can become so natural that it is no longer noticed. Attention begins to move outward automatically, scanning for relevance, approval, novelty, or threat. The mind becomes accustomed to constant stimulation, and silence begins to feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Yet paradoxically, it is precisely within this intensified environment that new forms of awareness begin to emerge. Many people, immersed in digital life, begin to notice patterns in their own attention that were previously hidden. The impulse to check, refresh, compare, or react becomes observable in real time. Thoughts that once seemed like identity itself begin to reveal themselves as transient responses to stimulation. Emotional states appear more clearly linked to external input than to any stable inner core. In this way, the digital age unintentionally creates conditions for a form of self-observation, not always peaceful, and not always deliberate, but increasingly unavoidable. A notification appears, and attention moves. A comparison arises, and emotion follows. A moment of silence emerges, and discomfort surfaces. In each case, awareness is present to notice the movement, even if it is immediately drawn back into it. This simple capacity to notice the movement of attention becomes a quiet doorway, because in noticing, a subtle distinction appears. There is the content of experience, and there is the knowing of that content. The feed, the message, the image, the thought all arise within something that is aware of them, without needing to become them. This recognition is easy to overlook, especially in an environment designed for continuous engagement. The digital world is not neutral. It is structured to capture attention and sustain it. It rewards reaction, not reflection. It encourages identification, not observation. And yet, awareness remains available even within these conditions. For some, the very saturation of information becomes a catalyst for inquiry. The exhaustion of constant input leads to a natural questioning. What is it that is actually experiencing all of this? Who is the one that feels overwhelmed, stimulated, or distracted? Unlike earlier eras where spiritual inquiry often required withdrawal from society, the modern digital environment forces this question into everyday life. It is no longer confined to monasteries or retreat settings. It appears in ordinary moments while scrolling, responding, consuming, comparing. In this sense, the digital age does not eliminate spiritual inquiry. It accelerates it, often without permission. However, this acceleration is not without tension. The same systems that reveal patterns of attention also reinforce them. The more awareness is captured, the more it is shaped into predictable loops. This creates a paradox. The environment that makes self-observation easier also makes sustained presence more difficult. Yet even within this paradox, something remains constant, no matter how fragmented attention becomes. There is always awareness of fragmentation. No matter how absorbed thought becomes, there is awareness of absorption. Even distraction is known. Even forgetting is known. This continuity is often overlooked because it is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not compete for attention. It simply is. The digital mirror, then, is not only a tool of distraction or connection. It is also an unintentional teacher. It reflects the mechanics of attention so clearly that, for those who begin to notice, the structure of identification becomes visible, and once something is seen clearly enough, it cannot be unseen. This does not immediately resolve the tension of modern life. It does not remove the pool of devices or the complexity of digital existence, but it introduces a subtle shift, the recognition that awareness is not confined to the screen, nor defined by it. The screen changes, the content changes, the identity projected and consumed changes, but the fact of knowing does not. And in that simple, unchanging fact, the inquiry of enlightenment in the digital age quietly continues. Chapter 7, Trauma, Healing, and the Return to Presence. In the unfolding story of modern consciousness, one truth has become increasingly difficult to ignore. Awakening is not only a matter of insight, but also of healing. For much of spiritual history, enlightenment was often framed as transcendence rising above the world, the body, and the mind. But the psychological realities of modern life have complicated that narrative. Beneath many spiritual aspirations lies something more immediate and human: unresolved trauma, emotional fragmentation, and nervous systems shaped by chronic stress. The 20th and 21st centuries brought this into sharp focus. Wars left psychological scars across generations. Rapid social change disrupted traditional support structures. Urban life, digital saturation, and economic pressure created environments where the human nervous system is frequently overstimulated or depleted. In this context, the inner world does not always appear as a serene space of contemplation. More often, it appears as a landscape of survival responses, conditioned reactions, and buried emotional material. As psychology and neuroscience developed further, a crucial insight emerged. The body is not separate from experience. Emotional states are not purely abstract mental events, they are embodied patterns of sensation, tension, movement, and regulation within the nervous system. What is called thought is often intertwined with physiological states, shaped by past experience. This recognition shifted the spiritual conversation in a significant way. It became clear that for many people, the main barrier to present moment awareness was not philosophical confusion, but unresolved reactivity. The mind may intellectually understand concepts like presence or non-attachment, yet the body may remain caught in patterns of fear, vigilance, or contraction. In such cases, attention is not freely available, it is already occupied by survival-based responses. This is where modern therapeutic approaches began to intersect more deeply with contemplative practice. Somatic therapies, trauma-informed psychology, and integrative healing modalities emphasize a simple but profound principle. Healing does not come from suppressing experience, but from allowing it to be fully felt in a safe and regulated way, rather than pushing difficult emotions away or trying to transcend them prematurely. These approaches encourage direct contact with sensation, memory, and feeling held within awareness that is steady enough not to be overwhelmed. In this process, something important often becomes visible. When attention is brought gently to bodily experience, the intensity of certain emotional patterns begins to shift. What once felt overwhelming starts to reveal itself as movement energy arising, peaking, and passing within a larger field of awareness. This is not merely psychological relief. It is a reorganization of relationship to experience, where trauma often creates fragmentation, splitting awareness. Between what is felt and what must be avoided, healing restores continuity. the individual begins to notice that even difficult sensations can be known without being destroyed by them. Fear can be felt, sadness can be allowed, anger can move, and through it all, awareness remains present. This is where the language of spirituality and the language of therapy begin to converge more clearly than before. Both point, in different ways, to the possibility of being present with experience, without being completely identified by it. However, the modern integration of healing and awakening also requires careful discernment. There is a tendency in some spiritual contexts to bypass psychological work by focusing exclusively on transcendent states or philosophical insights. This can lead to a subtle avoidance of unresolved pain, where the idea of non-attachment is used to distance oneself from emotions that actually need to be acknowledged and integrated. At the same time, purely psychological approaches may sometimes stop short of deeper inquiry into awareness itself, focusing primarily on content stories, patterns, and histories without fully exploring the nature of the observer, who is aware of them. The meeting point between these two approaches is where something more complete begins to form. In this integrated view, healing is not separate from awakening, it becomes part of it. The nervous system is not an obstacle to consciousness, it is one of its expressions. Emotional pain is not a failure of spirituality. It is often a signal pointing toward areas where awareness has been contracted or divided. As presence deepens, a gradual reorganization occurs. Experiences that once triggered immediate reactivity begin to be met with more space. This does not mean emotions disappear or become less human. Rather, they are less likely to be instantly fused with identity. A feeling can arise without immediately becoming a story about me. In this space, something subtle but transformative becomes possible. Experience can be fully allowed without being fully owned. This is not detachment in the sense of withdrawal. It is intimacy without entanglement, and in that intimacy, healing and awareness are no longer separate paths. They are two aspects of the same movement, the return of attention to itself, unfragmented. What emerges from this process is not a perfected or permanently peaceful state, but a more honest relationship with experience. Pain is still felt, joy is still felt, but neither is required to define the entirety of what one is. This is the quiet shift at the heart of trauma-informed spirituality in the modern age, not the escape from human experience, but the gradual realization that even within its most difficult expressions, awareness has never been absent, and in that recognition, presence is not something achieved after healing is complete. It is the very space in which healing becomes possible at all. Chapter 8. The Subtle Upheaval of Mindful Awareness. Toward the end of the 20th century, a quiet cultural shift began to unfold. A discipline that had long existed primarily within monasteries and contemplative traditions slowly entered ordinary, public life. Without fanfare, mindfulness found its way into clinics, classrooms, workplaces, and private homes. Its introduction appeared modest. Mindfulness was commonly described as the simple practice of paying attention to present experience with openness and without judgment. It did not require adherence to a religion, specialized doctrine, or elaborate ritual. Because of this simplicity, many initially regarded it as little more than a calming technique, yet the very absence of complexity allowed it to spread widely across modern society. This emergence occurred during a period when attention itself was becoming increasingly strained. Daily life grew faster, distractions multiplied, and people became surrounded by continuous streams of stimulation and information. The mind rarely rested. It moved endlessly through memories, predictions, worries, comparisons, and internal commentary. Presence became fragmented beneath the weight of constant mental activity. Mindfulness introduced an unfamiliar possibility within this environment, the ability to observe the movement of attention itself. Its modern development was strongly shaped by clinical applications. Programs such as mindfulness-based stress reduction (MBSR), introduced within healthcare settings, demonstrated that deliberate attention training could meaningfully affect psychological and physical well-being. Research and practice showed benefits related to stress reduction, emotional balance, chronic pain management, and anxiety. Participants learned to notice sensations directly, observe thoughts without immediately identifying with them, and repeatedly guide attention back to immediate experience. Over time, something deeper than symptom management began to appear. People discovered that thoughts and emotions could be experienced without complete immersion in them. A difficult feeling no longer had to become a total identity. A passing thought did not necessarily represent truth. Inner experiences could be observed as temporary processes rather than permanent definitions of self. Though subtle, this marks a profound psychological shift. A space begins to emerge between awareness and the experiences passing through it. Within that opening, habitual reactions weaken. The automatic assumption that every thought or emotion must define reality gradually loses its grip. Mindfulness also reveals another important insight. Attention is trainable. Human awareness is not fixed in its capacity. Through repeated practice, attention can become more stable, focused, and resilient. In much the same way that physical training develops the body, sustained attentional practice develops the ability to remain present amid distraction. This principle echoes far older. Contemplative traditions were disciplined. Awareness serves as a foundation for insight. Within Buddhist philosophy, mindfulness was never intended merely as a relaxation strategy. It formed part of a larger inquiry into the nature of consciousness, suffering, and perception itself. The aim was clarity, seeing experience directly rather than through layers of habit and distortion. As mindfulness became integrated into mainstream culture, however, its meaning often shifted. In many modern settings, it was repackaged as a productivity aid, a performance enhancer, or a stress management tool. This adaptation increased accessibility, yet it also introduced tension. When a practice originally rooted in self-understanding becomes primarily instrumental, something essential risks being reduced or overlooked. Even so, contemporary mindfulness still retains a transformative core. Again and again, it redirects attention toward immediate experience. It interrupts unconscious identification with mental activity. It reveals that what appears solid and permanent is actually fluid and continuously changing within awareness. Thoughts emerge and disappear. Emotions intensify and fade. Bodily sensations constantly transform. Experiences move in an endless process of arising and dissolving. Yet awareness itself remains present throughout. Because it is constant, awareness often escapes notice. It does not demand attention or announce itself dramatically. Nevertheless, it serves as the silent background within which every thought, sensation, and perception occurs. Most mindfulness practices begin very simply, noticing the breath, sensing the body, or observing thoughts without becoming entangled in them. Over time, these ordinary exercises can fundamentally alter one's relationship to experience. Instead of being swept away by every mental event, there is an increasing recognition that experience is appearing within awareness rather than defining it completely. This realization is usually quiet rather than dramatic. It is not necessarily mystical or extraordinary. Instead, it involves a gradual shift in identification from exclusive involvement with experience to recognition of the awareness that contains experience. For many contemporary perspectives on awakening or self-understanding, this shift is central. Awakening is not viewed as escaping ordinary life, but as perceiving experience differently. Mindfulness does not remove pain, uncertainty, or conflict from human existence. Difficult emotions and challenging circumstances continue to arise. What changes is the relationship to them. There is less automatic resistance, less immediate fusion with every passing state, and more openness through which experience can move. In this sense, mindfulness acts as a quiet disruption not by altering the external world, but by transforming the habitual patterns through which the mind interprets and organizes reality. And as the practice continues to expand across cultures and institutions, it continually points back to one enduring realization. Awareness is already here, and learning to recognize it changes the nature of experience even when outwardly nothing at all appears to change. Chapter 9. Non-duality in Modern Language. By the time the 21st century was well underway, a set of teachings that had once been confined to specialized philosophical or contemplative traditions began to circulate more widely under a single, modernized term, non-duality. At its core, non-duality points to something deceptively simple, the recognition that experience is not actually divided in the way it appears. The familiar sense of separation between me and the world, between observer and observed, is revealed not as an absolute structure of reality, but as a functional appearance within awareness. This is not an idea meant to be accepted intellectually. In fact, most non-dual teachings repeatedly emphasize the limitations of conceptual understanding. Language can gesture toward the truth, but it cannot contain it. Any attempt to turn non-duality into a fixed belief system tends to recreate the very division it points beyond. Instead, non-duality functions more like a direct inquiry into experience itself. When attention is turned inward, not in the psychological sense of analyzing thoughts, but in the immediate sense of noticing what is present, something fundamental becomes apparent. Thoughts appear, sensations appear, emotions appear, perceptions appear. Even the sense of being a separate thinker or observer appears as part of this unfolding field. What is striking is that none of these elements are experienced as self-contained. Each arises in relationship to the whole field of awareness in which it is known. From this perspective, the boundary between inner and outer begins to soften. The world is not experienced as something entirely outside consciousness, nor is consciousness experienced as something located inside the body as a separate object. Instead, both appear as expressions within a single, unified field of knowing. This does not negate practical distinctions in everyday life. It does not erase functional identity, language, or responsibility. A body still moves through space, decisions still occur, communication still happens, but the underlying assumption of separation is seen to be less solid than it once appeared. In modern presentations of non-duality, especially in the West, this insight is often expressed in varied ways. Some describe it as awareness being prior to thought. Others describe it as the recognition that everything arises in consciousness. Still others emphasize that there is no separate self, apart from the flow of experience itself. Despite differences in wording, the pointer is consistent. What you are looking for is not an object within experience, but the knowing of experience itself. One of the challenges of contemporary, non-dual discourse is its tendency to be misunderstood as abstract philosophy. But in its original spirit, it is not about constructing a theory of reality. It is about direct seeing. For example, if attention is placed on a sound, there is hearing. If attention is placed on a sensation, there is feeling. If attention is placed on a thought, there is thinking. In each case, what is constant is not the content, but the fact that it is known. This immediacy is central. It does not require belief. It requires noticing. Over time, sustained inquiry into this noticing can lead to a subtle but significant shift. The sense of being located exclusively inside the body, looking out at a separate world, begins to loosen. Experience is still functionally structured, but its boundaries become less rigid. The separation between subject and object appears more like a useful interpretation than an absolute division. In this recognition, language itself begins to show its limits. Words like inside and outside, self and world, observer and observed, are revealed as tools rather than truths. They help organize experience, but they do not define its ultimate nature. This is why non-dual traditions often use paradox, silence, or contradiction. These are not attempts to confuse, but to prevent the mind from prematurely turning living experience into fixed concepts. In the modern context, non-duality has also intersected with psychology, neuroscience, and mindfulness practice. Some therapists incorporate non-dual perspectives into approaches for reducing identification with painful thought patterns. Some meditators report shifts in perception where the sense of a separate self becomes less central or temporarily absent. Some researchers explore whether such experiences correlate with specific patterns of brain activity. Yet even with all of this integration, the essential point remains unchanged. Non-duality is not something to be added to experience. It is the recognition of what is already the case before interpretation. There is only ever experience appearing, and the knowing of that experience is not separate from it. This recognition is often described as liberating, not because it changes the content of life, but because it changes the way content is taken to be real. Suffering does not necessarily disappear, but the additional layer of resistance rooted in rigid identification can soften. Life continues, but the center from which it is interpreted begins to shift. And in that shift, something quietly profound is discovered. The sense of separation, that once seemed so fundamental, was never as fixed as it appeared. What remains is not an absence of experience, but a clear recognition of it unified, immediate, and already present in every moment of knowing. Chapter 10. Everyday Enlightenment. For much of human history, enlightenment was imagined as something extraordinary reserved for rare individuals who withdrew from ordinary life and entered states of profound transcendence. It was associated with distance from society, distance from desire, distance from the noise of daily existence. The implication was often that awakening required leaving life in order to find what life could not offer. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, as spiritual inquiry became woven into psychology, neuroscience, mindfulness, and daily practice, this assumption began to shift in a subtle but important way. Enlightenment started to be reconsidered not as an escape from life, but as a different way of relating to it. This does not mean that life becomes simplified or permanently peaceful. Ordinary existence remains what it has always been: unpredictable, demanding, sometimes beautiful, sometimes painful. Thoughts continue to arise, emotions continue to move, relationships, responsibilities, and uncertainties remain. Nothing external is fundamentally removed. What changes, if anything changes at all, is the way experience is held in awareness. In everyday enlightenment, the focus is not on achieving a special state, but on recognizing what is already present beneath the constant movement of thought and perception. It is the simple noticing that, even in the midst of complexity, awareness itself is not disturbed in the way content is disturbed. Experiences shift, but the fact of knowing remains. This recognition often appears in ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones. It can arise while walking through a city street, when attention briefly notices the play of sounds, sights, and sensations without immediately organizing them into narrative. It can appear in conversation, when listening becomes more direct and less filtered by anticipation or internal commentary. It can emerge during routine tasks, when there is a sudden clarity that experience is happening on its own, without requiring constant mental supervision. These moments are not necessarily prolonged or stable. They come and go, but they reveal something important: that awareness does not need to be manufactured. It is already functioning prior to effort. The modern framing of enlightenment increasingly reflects this ordinariness. Rather than being described as a final attainment, it is often spoken of as a shift in recognition, a change in what is assumed to be self. Instead of identifying exclusively with thought, narrative, and psychological continuity, there is a gradual seeing that all of these are appearances within a wider field of awareness. From this perspective, enlightenment is not the addition of something new, but the removal of unnecessary contraction around experience. Life continues to unfold as it always has. Decisions are made, plans are formed, emotions arise in response to events, but there is less compulsion to interpret every experience as a confirmation or threat to a fixed identity. There is more room for experience to be what it is, without immediate resistance or appropriation. This does not eliminate responsibility or engagement. In fact, many find that presence enhances responsiveness. When attention is less absorbed in internal narrative, there is often greater clarity in action. Listening becomes more accurate. Perception becomes less distorted by projection. Choices arise with less internal fragmentation. In this sense, everyday enlightenment is not withdrawal from life, but fuller participation in it. It is also important to recognize that this way of understanding enlightenment resists final definition. It is not a state that can be permanently secured, nor a concept that can be fully captured in language. Any attempt to turn it into a fixed achievement tends to recreate the very separation. It points beyond the sense of a seeker trying to become something other than what is already present. Instead, it is more accurately understood as a recognition that can be forgotten and remembered, obscured and re-noticed, depending on the movement of attention. What matters is not perfection of attention, but familiarity with returning to it. Over time, this return becomes less dramatic. It is not experienced as a special event, but as a simple relaxation of identification. A thought is seen as a thought. A sensation is seen as a sensation. A moment of confusion is seen within awareness, rather than as an identity. In this way, enlightenment becomes inseparable from ordinary life. It is not located elsewhere in a future state, a special experience, or a distant realization. It is present in the very structure of experience as it is happening now. The challenge is not to create it, but to notice what has never been absent. And so the journey that began with collapse, inquiry, psychology, tradition, neuroscience, and digital reflection returns here not to an endpoint, but to immediacy, to this moment, to the simple fact that experience is happening, and it is being known. Nothing added, nothing removed, just awareness, as it has always been. Conclusion: the unfinished awakening. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, the idea of enlightenment has not disappeared, it has evolved, fractured, and quietly reassembled itself in new forms. What once appeared as a distant spiritual attainment has increasingly revealed itself as something closer, more immediate, and more intertwined with ordinary human life. This evolution did not follow a single path. It moved through psychology and psychotherapy, where the hidden architecture of the mind was mapped, and the unconscious became accessible terrain. It moved through Eastern contemplative traditions, which offered precise methods for observing consciousness directly. It moved through neuroscience, which began to describe the biological correlates of attention and self-reference. It moved through counterculture movements that questioned inherited meaning, and through mindfulness practices that brought attention back to the present moment in practical, everyday ways. And it moved through the digital age, where attention itself became both fragmented and newly visible. Each of these developments contributed something essential, yet none of them completed the picture. Instead, they collectively revealed a pattern. The deeper humanity investigates consciousness, the more it encounters not a final object of understanding, but a field that includes all objects of understanding. In this sense, enlightenment in the modern era is not a fixed destination. It is an ongoing clarification of perception. It is the gradual recognition that experience is always already occurring within awareness, and that the sense of a separate, fixed observer is itself part of that experience. This recognition does not resolve all of life's difficulties. It does not prevent pain, uncertainty, or complexity. The modern world remains as it is, fast-moving, interconnected, and often overwhelming. Human beings still experience loss, conflict, confusion, and change. But what shifts, subtly, and sometimes profoundly, is the way these experiences are held. There is a difference between being completely absorbed in the content of experience and also recognizing the awareness in which that content appears. In that difference, even if it is slight, something opens, a bit more space, a bit less contraction, a bit more clarity in the midst of movement. Importantly, this is not a philosophy to be accepted or rejected. It is not a belief system competing with others. It is a pointer toward what is already the case before interpretation arises. Every thought, every sensation, every perception is already known, and that knowing is not an object among other objects. It is the condition in which all objects appear. The unfinished nature of awakening in the 21st century is not a flaw. It reflects something essential about consciousness itself. Awareness does not finalize into a static conclusion. It continues to reveal, moment by moment, the unfolding of experience. Any attempt to turn it into a final answer tends to obscure its living immediacy. In this way, enlightenment is less like a peak that is reached and more like a way of seeing that becomes increasingly natural. It is not the end of inquiry, but the refinement of it. Not the end of life, but a different relationship to it. And so the story does not close in the traditional sense. It cannot, because what it points to is not a conclusion in time, but the presence of awareness in which time itself appears. What remains is not an answer, but attention, not a final state, but this moment continuously unfolding, continuously known, and in that simple fact, the inquiry continues, quietly and without end.